All right, so this is where we left off, and the next thing we're going to do is UV unwrapping. So let's get started with that, and I'm going to show you a couple of tricks that can help you with UV unwrapping because we've only really done sort of basic, very basic UV unwrapping so far. So I'm going to click the handle first because that will be very easy to unwrap, and then I'm going to hit / to isolate it, and then tab into edit mode. And there is a fast way to place seams for UV unwrapping. And so if I alt click this and I hit Control E mark seam, that's how we did UV unwrapping previously. And then A to select all and U to unwrap. And if we go into the UV editing tab, you can see this is our unwrapped, our sort of laid out flat version of that mesh here for us to start applying materials to it. But what I wanted to show you was that, and I'm just going to Control E clear seam to show you that you can also do this with control clicking. So if I hit, for example, if I am in edge select mode and I select this edge and then I select control click, it'll select from the first one you selected all the way to the last edge you selected. And here under edge tag, you can change it to tag seam. And now, when you control click from one edge to another, it will draw a seam along where you've selected. And if you do it again, it will get rid of it. So that's a good thing for you to know, just because that can make it very easy, especially when you're unwrapping complex meshes, to add seams. So again, I'm just gonna, and I should turn on screencast keys here. I'm just gonna alt click and Control E mark seam to mark a seam along this edge here. And let's now hit / to go out of that isolate mode, and let's unwrap this cylinder. And / to isolate this, tab into edit mode. And again, there are different ways that you could unwrap objects like this. A good way to unwrap cylinders is to mark a seam around the top and bottom edges. And so now, like, this whole area will lay out flat, and then we have this ring, and we just need to mark a seam here, and now, like, this whole area will also lie out flat. So that's a good way to unwrap cylinders. And if I hit U to unwrap in the UV editing window, you can see this is how that shape unwraps. So we have sort of just lays out sort of flat and long, and then the cylinder sort of top and bottom faces come out just like this. Now, to assist with UV unwrapping, it can sometimes be helpful to have a material that shows you where stretching is happening, and that's really easy to make. So I'm gonna just, over here on the right, let's put it on the handle first, hit new to make new material, and I'm just gonna call it I don't know, UV grid, something like that. Doesn't really matter. And then in the shading tab, for this material, I'm going to go Shift A, texture, image texture. And this, again, this is a container for an image texture, but there's no texture in it yet. So we can plug its color into the base color. And then normally what we would do is we would go like open and then go locate the image file you want to add. In this case, we're going to do new. And under generated type, we're going to select UV grid and then hit OK. And now if we go into material preview mode, if we look on the handle, you can see this is our material. It's like this sort of grid pattern. And the reason that it looks like this is just the grids can help you to see like where you've got tons of stretching. In this case, because we're working on a pretty simple shape, this is pretty okay. We don't have a lot of stretching. The only thing maybe to note is that our texture is angled a little bit here. If you wanted to fix that, there is a plugin for Blender called UV Squares. And if I just tab into edit mode, actually go into UV editing, A to select all, and then N, and I have installed UV Squares. I can select to grid by shape, and that will square the UV essentially. And I will leave a link to UV Squares in the description. You can download it, and again, you would install it the same way you install any other plugin, by going Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, Install. And if you don't install it, it's not a big deal. If this is a little bit angled, that's totally fine. Okay, so now if I go back here, now you can see that this is straight, although our we do have a little bit of stretching, right? Because these squares are no longer square; they're a little bit rectangle. So it does do a pretty good job most of the time. However, it doesn't do a 100% perfect job all of the time. So we can fix this by just hitting SY over here on the left on the UV panel to just scale that until this is sort of square, and that should be fine. And if we apply that UV grid material down here to the pommel, and actually I should probably name these layers. Let's rename this to pommel. Let's rename this to handle. We're going to merge these layers, but this will just help keep things organized. Guard and blade. So down here you can see that this unwrap is nice and square. However, the squares are a lot smaller than the squares on the handle, and what that essentially means is that the texture is going to be scaled a lot smaller. If we were to apply the same material to the handle and to the pommel, this one's going to be scaled a lot smaller, and we don't really want that. And what you can do to fix that is if you select both at once with shift click and then tab A to select all and U to unwrap. So it's unwrapping both of them at once. It will unwrap them both to the same scale, and that's looking a lot more uniform. So that's how you can unwrap different parts uniformly. I'm going to go ahead and do the guard and the blade now, and then we'll sort of unwrap everything and then start working on the materials. So for the guard, I'm going to put seams, I guess, here like this, and then one on this end all the way across, and then one here like that. And now that should unwrap correctly. And it did, but it's a little bit rotated, so you can just rotate it back like this. Now for the blade, we can just, I think, sort of cut it in half. So if we tab into edit mode, I'm just going to alt click to select this edge that goes all the way around, and hit Control E, mark seam, and U to unwrap. And we've got this warning here. It says object has non-uniform scale. That just means I forgot to Control A, apply rotation and scale. And so now if you hit U to unwrap, we won't get that message, and we have an unwrapped blade over here on the left. All right, so let's unwrap, finish unwrapping the rest of this. So this is the only, so we actually unwrapped everything. The only issue is this blade, you can see, has a much larger UV scale than these, which means that the texture that's applied to this surface, if we were to apply the same material to this and this, it would be a lot larger on this. And so what we should do is to unwrap them all together. And if I look at the UVs for that, the only issue is, you can see we're not really taking good advantage of the UV space here. We have a lot of essentially empty space. For us, that won't matter too much because we're going to be applying a procedural texture material to this. But that is something you just want to keep in mind, is that it's generally better to take advantage of as much of the UV space as possible. And the reason that it's good to try and take advantage as much as possible of the available space here in the UV space is because if I make this larger, right, we're applying more pixels to the surface of the object, and that essentially means that the texture resolution on those areas is going to be higher. So if you have, a 1K texture that's applied to this guard and to this handle, but the UVs are like really small like this, you're not going to be applying much of that 1K textures resolution to those surfaces, and so it'll look blurry. But in our case, we're not going to worry about it too much because this will be okay for us. So I'm going to hit unwrap to unwrap everything, and then I'm just going to straighten up this using the UV squares add-on. And then for this guard, because I can see this UV grid material is rotated a bit, I'm also just going to straighten it up. So there we go. We have UV unwrapped our whole object, and we're now in a state where we're ready to start working on materials. So we're going to put some materials on this in the next video. So I will see you there.